Hi, Professor Wills here, Pasadena City College. So I wanted to pop on for a few minutes to give a little mini lecture at the beginning of our unit on the art of late antiquity. As I already had given some preliminary information attached to this lecture in your Canvas module, late antiquity really is considered sort of art historically a distinct era, although it is more or less concurrent with the late Roman Empire. It's distinct because of its content. The subject and themes of the art of late antiquity focus on early Christian themes, and sometimes even touch on Jewish or Hebrew themes as well. What we're going to examine is an example found in a surprising place. For those of you who enjoy catacombs, I'm going to take you there. But within those catacombs, besides the skulls and bones of those interred there, we're going to also check out some really cool early art connected to the earliest Christians associated with this period in late antiquity. So let's get to that PowerPoint and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, let's get our slideshow going here for y'all. Okay, so our unit that we're focusing on now as we are exploring this arena, as I mentioned, is focusing on late antiquity. That will be followed by our unit on Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, which is the kind of evolutionary successor of what became the Eastern Roman Empire. And then from that point, we're going to fall back and explore back in more Western Europe, the early Middle Ages, to see how the spread of Christianity really affects the arts, but also kind of marries into all of the different warrior lord sects, whether the Saxons or the Vikings, etc. So it's a very interesting unit, but and of course, right here, we're going to also explore a lot more mosaic art. I know I started to touch on that a little bit with the Roman Empire and Pompeii, those majestic, tragic ruins from the explosion of Mount Vesuvius. We're going to really see this continue and be fully embraced as with religious architecture. We're going to start to see more of an emphasis on interior decoration than exterior. All right, let's get then, instead of above ground or in the heavenly realm, let's get below ground. And I don't mean hell, I mean just a few feet underground, maybe a few hundred feet in the city of Rome. And like Paris, some of the oldest catacombs are to be found in Rome. The Roman catacombs that you see here are not just one single corridor or hallway, but can extend some 90 miles, if you can believe that. And some of them are 5 levels deep, so it is a real labyrinth in many ways, almost evocative of the Palace of Knossos and the lair of the famous Minotaur monster. Or maybe it makes you think, since we're in Italy, of the Etruscans and their subterranean tombs in the Banditace necropolis, right? So it's an interesting kind of, practice that we've seen, the subterranean burial practices. Now, perhaps you are just awarded in ancient times a shelf for your remains, but if you happen to be a wealthier citizens, you'll get something a little bit more fancy. And by the way, they think some 4 million people had their remains interred in these Roman catacombs, if you can believe it. All right, another view of some of the storage space, if you will, for the remains. And again, these could be Christians and to some extent Jews as well. Were buried in this vast network of catacombs under the city of Rome. All right, I'm going to take myself away here so you can read the caption information here. But what we're going do is we're going to visit a place called a cubiculum, pardon me. And a cubiculum is a more elaborate space, a mortuary for the wealthy, almost like a family crypt, I guess you could think of it in that way. This dates from the early 4th century. And as you can see, if we look upward among the bones and skulls, you can find that the space has been decorated in the form of painting in fresco. It's a very common painting technique where you paint into a thin application of wet plaster, and then the paint and the plaster dry at the same time, so you get this really durable medium, which is part of the reason why some of the artwork that we see here on the walls of this cubiculum survive. Now, I'm going to come back to the Good Shepherd. That is the figure in the middle. I'll give you a little detailed shot of that coming up. But another theme of this fresco mural is the story of Jonah. Some of you who had to go to Sunday school, maybe when you were a little kid, might have heard the story of Jonah and the whale. And that is an Old Testament biblical story where Jonah was given a direct order by God. God commanded Jonah, I want you to go to this city, it's an old city in Mesopotamia, and deliver a prophecy or message from me. And Jonah didn't like those people. He felt that they were the enemy of his people, the Israelites. And so he refused to go and instead ran away, hopping aboard a ship to escape God's wrath and anger, thought he could sail out to sea and evade getting in trouble. And of course, God sent a fierce storm, and the storm rocked the boat. And so the crewmaster of the ship just told Jonah, you have to get off. They threw him off of the boat. And what happened next is a whale, as it's been told in popular culture, probably some kind of biblical old giant fish, supposedly swallowed Jonah. And so, in the belly of the whale, Jonah had a few days to think about what a bad boy he's been, and he repented and asked for God's forgiveness. And lo and behold, the whale expelled him, and Jonah was able to make it to shore and repent and realize how wrong he had been, and to realize, of course, that God had shown mercy to him as well. Now, if you look at directly above our heads, if we were standing in that cubiculum, you could see some of in the lunettes, these half semicircular shapes known as lunettes. You can see some elements from the story. For instance, here's the boat that Jonah tried to run away on by sailing away from God after he defied his order. On the opposite side, you can just make out this creature here. It looks like a sea dragon, but you have to think back in this time period, in the early 4th century, these artists had no idea what a whale looked like. So they used their imaginations to create this kind of sea monster that swallowed Jonah. But with his arms extended, this is showing us that Jonah has been released from his imprisonment in the belly of the whale, right? No more time out for Jonah. He's been expelled, and you get this gesture of release. It's kind of an iconic gesture because it looks a little bit like how Christ, when he was crucified, with his arms out, it's evocative of that. And that's why the story of Jonah and the whale is so popular, because in many ways, it's a forerunner to the story of the resurrection of Christ, where Christ was, put to death, right, for mankind's sins and subsequent redemption. So in some ways, there's just sort of a resurrection, if you will, of Jonah, but it's sort of, again, showing kind of the precursor to that through an Old Testament story, and then connecting in the minds of the viewer to Jesus and his resurrection. All right, here Jonah, of course, is reclined on some kind of a chaise lounge there. Probably it's meant to be kind of evocative of him considering God's mercy, but it's, to the modern eye, it's an obvious opportunity for that old kind of heroic new type to come through in the depiction of Jonah, just like we would have seen in ancient Greece or High Empire Rome. So those are those elements, that we're still seeing in late antiquity, where some things can look very distinctly Roman in aesthetics, but the content is not about Roman mythology, or we're talking about Christian content here. All right, let's get to these figures here. So in between the lunettes, you're going to see these standing figures with their hands out in this gesture. These are called orants, and this is an attitude of prayer. So instead of a praying gesture, this is meant to be some kind of a gesture helping those who are praying or trying to connect to God, that kind of thing. And now we're ready to get into that center image. All right, let me show you a little bit of a closer peek at it. This is called a certain subject type called the Good Shepherd. And I showed you that in the opening slide here. And that's because it is a shepherd boy. And I know it's deteriorated with age, but what you find is a young male figure, clean shaven, holding around his shoulders a lamb, and he's wearing a short toga, and other lamb or sheep are surrounding this figure as, a flock gathers around a shepherd, right? Does anyone happen to know who that actually is? Because this is not just some ordinary country shepherd boy. This is somebody much more significant at this point in late antiquity. Here's another version, just to give you another clue, another or indifferent Good Shepherd fresco in the Catacomb of Priscilla in the Roman catacombs. I know it's sort of evocative of our old favorite, the calf bearer, but remember this from archaic period Greece was meant to be an animal gift sacrifice for the goddess Athena. These animals are not, in this case goats, are not meant to be animal sacrifices. Anybody have a clue? Well, I'll fill you in. What we're looking at with this, if you see a young man with a flock gathered around him, at this point in late antiquity, it's meant to be Jesus. Jesus with his flock. So these animals are meant to represent the sinners, that he's gathered together to follow him. And that's why you see him in the guise of a shepherd. And to this day, sometimes in some illustrated Bibles, you see him portrayed in that way. I know we're not used to seeing Jesus clean shaven either. Here's a sculptural relief of a Good Shepherd type once again. But here in another fresco with a little bit more detail we can see here. But yeah, in the early days of Christianity, Jesus wasn't sort of this figure we're used to seeing with the long hair and the long beard and long robe, kind of a Jared Leto look like that actor. Instead, he looks youthful. He's in kind of a classical toga, essentially, right? A very familiar kind of Roman period attire. And of course, the requisite animals, referencing his, leadership, gathering sinners, converting them to Christianity, growing the flock, that kind of thing. So, some of the themes that one can find in the Roman catacombs, catering to Old Testament and New Testament themes for the millions interred at that point in history. Thanks for joining me.